The first week of testing on the Throne of Thunder PTR has recently concluded, and I think there are some pretty interesting takeaways from the raid as a whole. I played approximately 20 hours across 10-man, guild raids and 25-man pugs, and I got to see all the content in at least some capacity except Raw Den. A lot of people hyped this raid up to be an enormous step up from previous content, and the question was whether this would still be the case in World of Warcraft Classic, where people are generally a lot better at the game and are playing classes that aren't necessarily tuned around the content. I want to dive into class performance a bit in this video, especially when it comes to tanking, but it will likely not be too relevant as Cyrene has mentioned over on Twitter that class tuning is coming this upcoming test weekend. But I will still give a rough idea about where each tank stands with this new content in mind. Most of my PTR adventures are streamed over on Twitch, where I stream the raids and give my thoughts when it comes to tanking. I'll be live this upcoming weekend for round 2 of testing, so click link in the description if you want to follow along for the journey. With that out of the way, let's dive in to Throne of Thunder. While I think the raid overall was a step up from previous tier, I don't think it's necessarily harder than most of the content we've seen in Classic so far. There are some outliers, like Dark Animus and Lei Shen, but most groups that raid on Heroic difficulty in tier 14 should have no issues clearing a good amount of bosses on Heroic week 1. One thing that was quite clear during the beta, however, was that the raid is very unforgiving, and that meant that you could quite easily lose people to somewhat random things during certain encounters. That meant in 25-man, you could afford to have people fail the mechanics or just lay dead on the floor for the whole encounter, whereas you didn't have that same luxury in 10-man. I know several extremely competent 10-man groups who struggle with Horde on Council and Megara, bosses that most 25-man guilds could breeze right through. I wasn't able to get a ton of experience on 10-man myself, but I can imagine certain encounters like Dark Animus being easier on 10-man due to having fewer golems to deal with. Coming from a 25-man perspective, the first 6 bosses offered very little resistance. The 7th boss was not available for testing, but after that point, the raids started getting harder with the exception of Iron Quan, which is actually one of the easier bosses in the raid. Unless you're in a cutting-edge guild, Dark Animus is likely to be a boss that you will skip early on. It's a boss that requires a ton of coordination, where one mistake can often snowball into a wipe. With all that said, I think the raid is in a pretty good spot when it comes to difficulty. It offers an adequate challenge while progressing, but once you get some gear from the current tier, things will fall over insanely quickly. So, the raid was not without bugs. Like I mentioned earlier, Durumu was not available for testing at all, as one of the core mechanics did not work. Similarly, Ji-Kun and Primordius also had core mechanics that were not implemented, but it did not prevent us from going further into the raid. A lot of people were complaining about spirits on Horadon, but they were in fact working as they did back in the days. People who were targeted by spirits that use abilities that drop threat like Feign Death or Fade would have their spirits go on a new target, a target that could not see the spirits. Now, while this is bliss-like, I'm not sure if this is the best way for it to work. Having the spirit continue to fixate on people who drop threat would make more sense and make the encounter, I think, more fun. Lei Shen was bugged as well, with the platforms not working properly after his intermissions, but not a lot of guilds got to see this boss on Heroic. Since the next session is very close to the first one, I'm a little bit worried about all the things being fixed as we head into the second week of testing. The second test is currently the last one that has been announced, but I would be very surprised if we only get 2 sessions, both based on how many issues were prevalent in the first round, but also because it's simply a huge raid that most guilds have not gone to test fully. Dragon Soul, despite having 5 fewer bosses, got 3 sessions of PTR, and with class tuning going into this phase as well, I would suspect that we get a 3rd session for TOT as well. For me personally, the strength of certain classes were not that surprising going into TOT. Generally, Shamans and Warriors provided incredible value. Because Stormlash scales with attack power, the high vengeance levels of tanks made Stormlash incredibly broken on several fights, especially in Dark Animus. A lot of fights also value Cleave a lot, making Elemental a lot more attractive than it was in tier 14. Tanking wise, things were exactly as I thought they would be going into the raid. Because there are so many encounters where you can easily gain high vengeance, either through the fight naturally bringing heavy tank damage or through some clever cheats, the tanks that can abuse this will heavily outperform the classes that can't. Protection Warrior stood as a clear outlier among the tanks due to their high attack power scaling of Shield Barrier, which trivializes damage intake once you have high enough Vengeance. Additionally, so many of the fights offered the ability to have small adds attack you to funnel revenge resets for more rage, meaning even more Shield Barrier value. Guardian Druid remained a solid option, especially offensively due to their 15% inherent damage buff in Classic, but I expect this to go away before the next raid testing. While there are certain mechanics that don't necessarily play into their toolkit, like triple puncture being undodgeable, they are still very sturdy with their large health pool and high armor values. Brewmaster Monk also stands out in this raid, but mostly due to their ability to spread their raid guards to the group. The ability to cleave on so many mobs with high vengeance, in addition to a lot of bosses having damage amplifications, means that the Brewmaster will often keep the raid very healthy, especially on 10-man. Protection Paladin also seems like a solid pick, but mostly if you're able to play around Vengeance and Adventure Shield resets. In TOT, they really lean into that active mitigation playstyle with a lot of tank busters, which Protection Paladin handles very well. A lot of fights also become one-tankable with bubbles, but this is not necessarily unique to Protection Paladins, as any tank can do the same thing, assuming they have 1 or 2 Paladins in their raid with Bop. Blood Death Knight, in my opinion, is the tank that performs the worst in TOT. The lack of defensive scaling with Vengeance and little to no active mitigation to deal with tank busters simply makes them less viable than other tanks. They do have niche use cases, like being able to solo tank the first boss and resetting slam stacks on Dark Animus, but apart from that, they are extremely lackluster at the moment. Healing-wise, there's no big shakeup in the meta, but I will say that I was very impressed by Holy Paladin throughput. Unlike Tier 14, several encounters disincentivizes stacking as a raid, which increases the relative value of Holy Paladins compared to the likes of Resto Shamans and Holy Priests. This priest still reigns supreme, especially with the amount of damage amplifiers in the raid and how valuable external cooldowns and raid cooldowns are in this raid. Overall, I would say that I have had a lot of fun with this raid. As a tank, there are so many things to min-max and patterns to master in order to tank the most effectively. It's a slightly gimmicky raid, so whether I'll feel the same after a few reclears, well, who knows. The difficulty curve is lower than I expected, but after taking a step back, I think that is a very healthy thing for Classic, for things not to be extremely difficult. The raid will offer an adequate challenge for most guilds early on, and with how powerful the upgrades from the raids are, it should get a lot easier over time for the more casual guilds to clear the content, especially with the guaranteed Thunderforge system. Lastly, I'm constantly posting tank-related content on my Discord, so if you want to have the most up-to-date information when it comes to biz lists, tank guides, vengeance, cheesing, etc., then that is the place to be. I've linked to it in the description and would be happy to see you there. But that's all for now. Thank you very much for watching. Until next time.